Uther eased himself out of his chair and stood huge and grim on Caer Cadern's wall to pronounce the name of his newborn grandson, the name of his heir, and the name of his kingdom's Edling. The winter-born babe would be named after his father. He would be called Mordred. Norwenna and the baby came to us at Innis Swydrin. They were brought in an ox cart across the eastern land bridge to the Tor's foot, and I watched from the windy summit as the sick mother and the maimed child were lifted from their bed of fur cloaks and carried in a cloth litter up the path to the stockade. It was cold that day, a bitter snow-bright cold that ate at the lungs, chapped the skin, and made Norwenna whimper as she was carried with her swaddled babe through the land gate of Innis Swydrin's Tor. Thus did Mordred, Edling of Domnonia, enter Merlin's realm. Innis Swydrin, despite its name, which means the Isle of Glass, was not a true island, but rather a promontory of high ground that jutted into a waste of sea marsh, creeks, and willow-edged bogs, where sedge and reeds grew thick. It was a rich place, made so by wildfowl, fish, clay, and the limestone that could easily be quarried from the hills edging the tidal wastes, that were crossed by wooden trackways, on which unwary visitors were sometimes drowned when the wind came hard from the west and blew a high tide fast across the long green wetlands. To the west, where the land rose, there were apple orchards and wheat fields, and to the north, where pale hills edged the marshes, cattle and sheep were herded. It was all good land, and at its heart was Innis Swydrin. This was all Lord Merlin's land. It was called Avalon, and had been ruled by his father and his father's father, and every serf and slave within sight of the Tor's summit worked for Merlin. It was this land, with its produce trapped and netted in the tidal creeks, or grown on the rich soil of the inland river valleys, that gave Merlin the wealth and freedom to be a druid. Britain had once been the land of druids, but the Romans had first slaughtered them, then tamed the religion, so that, even now, after 2 generations without Rome's rule, only a handful of the old priests remained. The Christians had taken their place, and Christianity now lapped around the old faith like a wind-driven high tide splashing through the demon-haunted reed beds of Avalon. Avalon's isle, Innis Swydrin, was a cluster of grassy hills, all of them bare except for the Tor, which was the steepest and highest. At its summit was a ridge, where Merlin's hall was built, and beneath the hall was a spread of lesser buildings, protected by a wooden stockade, perched precariously at the top of the Tor's steep grassy slopes, which were scraped into a pattern of terraces, left from the old days before the Romans came. A narrow path followed the ancient terraces, winding its intricate way towards the peak, and those who visited the Tor in search of healing or prophecy were forced to follow that path, which served to baffle the evil spirits who might otherwise come to sour Merlin's stronghold. 2 other paths ran straight down the Tor's slopes, one to the east, where the land bridge led to Innis Swydrin, the other westward, from the sea gate down to the settlement at the Tor's foot, where fishermen, wild-fowlers, basket-weavers, and herdsmen lived. Those paths were the everyday entrances to the Tor, and Morgan kept them free of evil spirits by constant prayers and charms. Morgan gave special attention to the western path, for it led not only to the settlement, but also to Innis Swydrin's Christian shrine. Merlin's great-grandfather had let the Christians come to the isle in Roman times, and nothing had been able to dislodge them since. We children of the Tor were encouraged to throw stones at the monks and toss animal dung over their wooden stockade, or laugh at the pilgrims who scuttled through the wicket gate to worship a thorn tree that grew next to the impressive stone church which had been built by the Romans and still dominated the Christian compound. One year, Merlin had a similar thorn tree enthroned on the Tor, and we all worshipped it by singing, dancing, and bowing. The village's Christians said we would be struck down by their god. But nothing happened. We burned our thorn in the end, and mixed its ashes with the pig feed. But still, the Christian god ignored us. The Christians claimed that their thorn was magic, and that it had been brought to Iniswydren by a foreigner who had seen the Christian god nailed to a tree. Oh, may God forgive me, but in those distant days I mocked such stories. I never understood then what the thorn had to do with a god's killing. But now I do, though I can tell you that the sacred thorn, if it still grows in Iniswydren, is not the tree sprung from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea. I know that, for one dark winter's night, when I had been sent to fetch Merlin a flask of clean water from the sacred spring at the Tor's southern foot, I saw the Christian monks digging up a small thorn bush to replace the tree that had just died inside their stockade. The holy thorn was always dying, though whether that was because of the cow dung we threw at it, or simply because the poor tree was overwhelmed by the cloth strips tied to it by pilgrims, I cannot tell. The monks of the holy thorn became rich anyway, fattened by the generous gifts of the pilgrims. The monks of Iniswydren were delighted that Norwenna had come to our stockade, for now they had a reason to climb the steep path and bring their prayers into the heart of Merlin's stronghold. The Princess Norwenna was still a fierce and sharp-tongued Christian, despite the failure of the Virgin Mary to deliver her child, and she demanded that the monks be admitted every morning. I do not know if Merlin would have allowed them into the compound, and Nimue certainly cursed Morgan for granting her permission. But Merlin was not at Iniswydren in those days. We'd not seen our master for more than a year, but life in his strange fastness went on without him. And strange it was. Merlin was the oddest of all Iniswydren's inhabitants, but around him, for his pleasure, he had assembled a tribe of maimed, disfigured, twisted, and half-mad creatures. The captain of the household and commander of its guard was Druidan, a dwarf. He stood no higher than a 5-year-old child, yet he had the fury of a full-grown warrior, and dressed each day in greaves, breastplate, helmet, cloak, and weapons. He railed against the fate that had stunted him, and took his revenge on the only creatures smaller still, the orphans whom Merlin gathered so carelessly. Few of Merlin's girls were not fanatically pursued by Druidan, though when he had tried to drag Nimue into his bed, he had received an angry beating for his pains. Merlin had hit him about the head, breaking Druidan's ears, splitting his lips and blacking his eyes, while the children and the stockade's guards cheered. The guards Druidan commanded were all lame, or blind, or mad, and some of them were all three, but none was mad enough to like Druidan. Nimue, my friend and childhood companion, was Irish. The Irish were Britons, but they had never been ruled by the Romans, and for that reason counted themselves better than the mainland Britons, whom they raided, harried, enslaved, and colonized. If the Saxons had not been such terrible enemies, then we would have considered the Irish the worst of all the gods' creatures, though from time to time we made alliances with them against some other tribe of Britons. Nimue had been snatched from her family in a raid Uther made against the Irish settlements in Demetia, that lay across the wide sea fed by the River Severn. 16 captives were taken in that raid, and all were sent back to become slaves in Dumnonia. But while the ships were crossing the Severn Sea, a great storm blew from the west, and the ship carrying the captives foundered on Inisware. Nimue alone survived, walking out of the sea, it was said, without even being wet. It was a sign, Merlin claimed, that she was loved by Manawydan, the sea god, though Nimue herself insisted that it had been Dom, the most powerful goddess, who had saved her life. Merlin wanted to call her Vivian, a name dedicated to Manawydan, but Nimue ignored the name and kept her own. Nimue almost always got her own way. She grew up in Merlin's mad household, with a sharp curiosity and a self-possessed confidence, and when, after maybe 13 or 14 of her summers had passed, Merlin ordered her to his own bed. She went as though she had known all along that her fate was to become his lover, and thus, in the order of these things, the second most important person in all Iniswydrin. Although Morgan did not yield that post without a struggle. Morgan, of all the weird creatures in Merlin's house, was the most grotesque. She was a widow, and 30 summers old when Norwenna and Mordred came to be her wards, and the appointment was appropriate, for Morgan was high-born herself. She was the first of the 4 bastards, 3 girls and a boy, fathered on Ingrain of Gwynedd by High King Uther. Her brother was Arthur, and with such a lineage and such a brother, it might be thought ambitious men would have beaten down the walls of the other world itself to claim the widow's hand. Yet as a young bride, Morgan had been trapped in a burning house that had killed her new husband and scarred Morgan horribly. The flames had taken her left ear, blinded her left eye, seared the hair from the left side of her scalp, maimed her left leg, and twisted her left arm, so that naked, Nimue told me, the whole left side of Morgan's body was wrinkled, raw red, and distorted, shriveled in some places, stretched in others, gruesome everywhere. Just like a rotted apple, Nimue told me, only worse. Morgan was a creature from nightmare, but to Merlin she was a lady fit for his high hall, and he had trained her to be his prophetess. He had ordered one of the High King's goldsmiths to fashion her a mask that fitted over her ravaged head like a helmet. The gold mask had a hole for her one eye and a slit for her twisted mouth, and was made out of thin, fine gold that was chased in spirals and dragons, and fronted with an image of Sononos, the horned god, who was Merlin's protector. Gold-faced Morgan, always dressed in black, had a glove on her withered left hand, and was widely famed for her healing touch and gifts of prophecy. She was also the worst-tempered woman I ever met. Sybil was Morgan's slave and companion. Sybil was that rarity, a great beauty with hair the colour of pale gold. She was a Saxon, captured in a raid, and after the warband had raped her for a season, she had come gibbering to Iniswydrin, where Morgan had healed her mind. Even so, she was still crazed, though not wicked mad, just foolish beyond the dreams of foolishness. She would lie with any man, not because she wanted to, but because she feared not to, and nothing Morgan did could ever stop her. She gave birth year after year, though few of the fair-haired children ever lived, and those that did, Merlin sold as slaves to men who prized golden-haired children.